What did the ordinary soldiers and generals tell their loved ones when they rode home before and after the Battle of Gettysburg that turned the course of the Civil War? How did they remember the carnage of the bloodiest battle of the Civil War? We reflect both on the letters of General Pickett and ordinary soldiers writing home in the memoirs of General James Longstreet, a close associate of Robert E. Lee during the war, and the correspondence between Robert E. Lee and the Confederate President Jefferson Davis after the battle. For a broad overview of the Civil War, please view our video on the Civil War struggle through paintings. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare, which includes illustrations. Our sister blog includes footnotes, and both include our Amazon book links. In 1864, Union General Grant was besieging the Confederate forces in Vicksburg in upper Mississippi. Union forces had already conquered New Orleans and controlled the upper Mississippi River. If the river port of Vicksburg fell, the Union would control the entire Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in half. This was part of the Anaconda strategy to ensure Union victory, formulated by General Scott at the beginning of the war. Should some of Robert E. Lee's forces be sent to relieve the Confederate forces in Vicksburg? Robert E. Lee told Confederate President Jefferson Davis that he doubted that these forces could arrive in time, and that a better strategy would be to invade the northern state of Pennsylvania. Perhaps the Union would need to transfer some troops from the west to counter Lee's armies. Farms in Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley were being bled dry to feed and horse both armies. Now it was Pennsylvania's turn to be plundered. Robert E. Lee had recently won major Confederate victories at the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. If he could win another Confederate victory in Pennsylvania, perhaps France or England would support the Confederacy. Everyone remembered that French assistance was key in securing the American victory in the Revolutionary War less than a century earlier. Now, one factor in the recent Confederate victories was the intelligence provided by General Jeb Stuart after his Confederate cavalry rode north, circling around the Union forces. Now, at Gettysburg, when his cavalry forces again rode north, they had the good fortune of capturing a major Union supply wagon train. Now, unfortunately, several factors slowed down Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalry. This meant that they would not meet up with General Lee's forces before the Battle of Gettysburg began, which meant that Lee was blind about the exact disposition of the Union forces. A battle between the Union and Confederate cavalry at Brandy Station was inconclusive, further delaying the Confederate advance. The Federal forces were also moving north, forcing the Confederate cavalry into unfamiliar territory as they circled around. And finally, they had the misfortune of pulling all those wagons from that captured Union supply train, drastically slowing their progress. To summarize the Battle of Gettysburg, the two armies made contact on June 30th. The Confederates won the battle on July 1st, even though Robert E. Lee was unable to concentrate and organize his troops as he preferred. Lee continued the battle on the next day with mixed results. But the battles on July 3rd were disastrous for the Confederates, and the Confederate forces were slaughtered in the infamous Pickett's Charge. Gettysburg was seen as a Union victory as General Meade put up a competent defense. A truce was called on July 4th as both armies gathered their dead and wounded. Afterwards, Robert E. Lee's forces retreated, crossing the Potomac back into Virginia in driving rain some days later. President Lincoln was livid that General Meade did not pursue and finish off Lee's forces before they crossed the river. 6 months later, Ulysses Grant would be named general in charge of all Union forces. Now, in a letter to his fiancée in April 1863, Confederate General George Pickett lamented how the South faced long odds in the war. If the battle is not to the strong, then we may win. But when all our ports are closed and the world is against us, when for us a man killed is a man lost, while Grant may have 25 of every nation to replace one of his, it seems like the battle is to the strong. And he's referring to the many German immigrants who were serving in the Union Army. Before the battle, the Confederate General James Longstreet remembered they entertained a visiting British officer, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle, who was seeking the opportunity to observe the campaign as a non-combatant. As he traveled with us, He cheerfully adapted his tastes to the rough ways of Confederate soldiers and proved to be an interesting companion. To avoid the blockade, he came to the Confederacy through Mexico. He gave a graphic account of his travels in Texas after crossing the Rio Grande to the interior in a 2-horse hack. Now, Confederate General Longstreet was critical of the absence of Jeb Stuart's cavalry in the days leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg. In his memoirs, he remembered, "The raid and the absence of the cavalry at the critical moment were severely criticized throughout the Army and the country. The war plans adopted after a deep study were suddenly given over to gratify the youthful cavalryman's wish for a nomadic ride." And when he belatedly hooked up with the Confederate forces, Jeb Stuart was reprimanded by General Robert E. Lee. Now in June, Confederate General Pender wrote his wife, "Until we crossed the Maryland line, our men behaved as well as troops could, but here in Pennsylvania, it would be hard to restrain them, for they have an idea that they are to indulge in unlicensed plunder. They have done nothing like the Yankees do in our country, the Confederacy. They take poultry and hogs, but in most cases pay our Confederate money for it. We take everything we want for government use. The people are frightened to death and will do anything we suggest. The rascals have been expecting us and run off most of their stock and goods." Now, Confederate Sergeant Royster of Pender's division wrote his ma, "Yesterday and the day before, our soldiers plundered far and wide, taking butter, milk, apple butter, fruit, chickens, pigs, and horses, and everything they could lay their hands on. The people are frightened out of their senses." But he continued, "Yesterday, however, General Lee sent an order round that all stealing and plundering should be punished in each case with death, that officers should be held accountable for the execution of his orders, that he made war upon armed men, not upon women and children. I heard that 9 of our soldiers were shot yesterday for taking jewelry from off the persons of the women. Confederate quartermasters were empowered to impress everything necessary for the use of the army, but men are not allowed to have anything but what they buy. But inflation was so rampant in the South that the Confederate currency was next to worthless and could not buy anything in the North. Although it was not widespread, there was a Confederate brigade that brutally kidnapped hundreds of free black men and women from the countryside of Pennsylvania, selling them into slavery in the Confederate South. Now, General Anderson wrote to Longstreet this account of his conversation with Robert E. Lee on the first day of the battle. General Lee was intently listening to the fire of the guns and was very much disturbed and depressed. At length he said, more to himself than to me, "I cannot think of what has become of Stuart. I ought to have heard from him long before now. He may have met with disaster, but I hope not. In the absence of reports from him, I am in ignorance of what we have in front of us here. It may be the whole Federal Army, or it may only be a detachment. If it is the whole Federal force, we must fight a battle here." And Robert E. Lee often consulted with General Longstreet on war strategy. And he'd previously announced to General Longstreet that he would not make aggressive battle in the enemy's country. But when conferring with Robert E. Lee during the first battle, Longstreet opined, "We could not call the enemy to position better suited to our plans. All we have to do is to file around his left and secure good ground between him and his capital." But unexpectedly, Robert E. Lee impatiently struck the air with his closed hand, saying, "If the Union forces are here tomorrow, I will attack them." Now, on the morning before the battle commenced on the second day, General Longstreet remembers, General Lee was not ready with his plans. He had not heard from his cavalry, nor the movements of the enemy further from the information from a dispatch captured during the night. As soon as it was light enough to see, however, the enemy was found in position on his formidable heights awaiting us. Jeb Stuart's cavalry finally joined up with the Confederate forces in the afternoon. He was rebuffed when Robert E. Lee gruffly greeted him, "Well, General, you are here at last." On the morning of the third day before the battle commenced, General Longstreet remembered that General Lee rode over after sunrise and gave his orders. His plan was to assault the enemy's left center by a column composed of several Confederate divisions, reinforced by Pickett's brigades. I thought that it would not do, that the point had been fully tested the day before by more men when we were all fresh, that the enemy was there looking for us, as we heard him during the night putting up his defenses. General Longstreet ominously observed that the column of many thousands of Confederates would have to march a mile under concentrating battery fire and 1,000 yards under long-range musketry, that the conditions were different from those in the days of Napoleon, Winfield batteries had a range of 600 yards and musketry about 60 yards. And General Pickett remembers the slaughter. He wrote a doleful letter to his fiancée on July 4th, 1863, the day after his disastrous Pickett's charge. He told his fiancée, "A little before 3 o'clock I rode up to old Peter, his nickname for James Longstreet, for orders. I found him like a great lion at bay. I have never seen him so grave and troubled. For several minutes after I had saluted him, he looked at me without speaking. Then in an agonized voice, the reserve all gone, he said, 'Pickett, I am being crucified at the thought of the sacrifice which this attack will make. I have instructed Alexander to watch the effect of our fire upon the enemy, and when it begins to tell, he must take the responsibility and give you your orders, for I cannot.'" General Pickett continues, "While he was yet speaking, a note was brought to me from General Alexander. After reading it, I handed it to him, asking if I should obey and go forward. He looked at me for a moment, then held out his hand. Presently, clasping his other hand over mine without speaking, he bowed his head upon his breast. I shall never forget the look in his face nor the clasp of his hand when I said, 'Then, General, I shall lead my division on.'" General Pickett remembers, "The stern old war horse, God bless him, was weeping for his men, and, I know, praying that this cup might pass from them. I obeyed the silent assent of his bowed head, an assent given against his own convictions, given in anguish, and with reluctance." Pickett remembers that fateful charge. "My brave boys were full of hope and confident of victory as I led them forth, forming them in columns of attack. Though they knew the odds against them, they eagerly offered up their lives on the altar of duty, having absolute faith in their ultimate success. Over on Cemetery Ridge, the Federals beheld a scene never before witnessed on this continent, an army forming in line of battle in full view, under their very eyes, charging across a space nearly a mile in length over fields of waving grain and stubble, and then a smooth expanse, moving with the steadiness of a dress parade, the pride and glory soon to be crushed by an overwhelming heartbreak." Pickett laments, "Well, it is all over now. The battle is lost. Many of us are prisoners. Many are dead. Many wounded, bleeding, and dying. Your soldier lives and mourns, and but for you, my darling, he would rather, a million times rather, be back there with his dead, to sleep for all time in an unknown grave." During Pickett's charge, close to 9,000 Confederates were killed, wounded, or captured, which was 3/4 of Pickett's forces, compared to a loss of 1,500 Union casualties. Although General Pickett survived, over half of his field-grade officers were lost, and all of his brigade commanders fell. To his credit, Robert E. Lee took the blame, writing among his soldiers, declaring the disastrous charge was all my fault. 2 days later, with Confederates retreating to Virginia, General George Pickett wrote another missive to his fiancée, realizing that this loss was a blow to Confederate independence. The sacrifice of life on that blood-soaked field on the fatal third day was too awful for the heralding of victory, even for our victorious foe, who I think believe, as we do, that it decided the fate of our cause. General Longstreet remembered, on the retreat from Gettysburg, the Confederate army, already crippled of its pride, was met by the dispiriting news of another defeat at Vicksburg, which meant that Mississippi was free to the Federals from its source to the Gulf. The Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. About 25,000 Confederates were casualties, which was about a third of Lee's army. Also, a third of Lee's generals were casualties. About 20,000 Union soldiers were casualties, and General Meade's command was also devastated. But the Confederates could not replace their losses, while the Union states could. A month after this dreadful retreat, Confederate General Robert E. Lee pens this letter to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, addressing him as Your Excellency, as if he were a king. Now, Lincoln was never addressed in these terms. Was Robert E. Lee the only officer to address Davis in this manner? Robert E. Lee writes to Davis, "We must expect reverses, even defeats. They are sent to teach us wisdom and prudence, to call forth greater energies, and to prevent our falling into greater disasters. Our people only have to be true and united, to bear manfully the misfortunes incident to war, and all will come right in the end. The general remedy for the want of success in a military commander is his removal. This is natural, and in many instances proper, for no matter what may be the ability of the officer, if he loses the confidence of his troops, disaster must sooner or later ensue. I have been prompted by these reflections more than once since my return from Pennsylvania to propose to Your Excellency the propriety of selecting another commander for this army. The Confederate President Davis quickly declines this suggestion. He admits that an officer who loses the confidence of his troops should have his position changed, and that sometimes illness had prevented Lee from being as effective as he could have been. But then he asks Lee, "Suppose, my dear friend, that I were to admit, with all their implications, the points which you present. Where am I to find that new commander who is to possess the greater ability which you believe to be required? To ask me to substitute you by someone in my judgment more fit to command, or who would possess more of the confidence of the army, or of the reflecting men of this country, is to demand an impossibility." Now, what kept the men going during this war? The month after this dreadful battle, Captain Adams reveals in a letter to his brother what keeps him and his fellow soldiers going. After long marches and great exposure, when you've been forced to drag your tired body up onto our tired horse day after day, when you have been hungry, thirsty, and tired, and after breakfasting before sunrise, and have gone supperless to sleep again in a rainstorm long after night, when you have gone through all that a man can go through, except the worst of the sufferings, cold, then to get into camp at last and hear that a mail has come. 5 months later, in November 1863, when dedicating the military cemetery at Gettysburg, Lincoln consecrated the ground so that these deaths shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Many scholars compare Lincoln's Gettysburg Address to the ancient General Pericles' funeral oration during the Peloponnesian Wars. And you can also compare both of these to Winston Churchill's speeches during the time of the Battle of Britain, when Nazi bombers were devastating London. We have other reflections on the Civil War, including showing that the Confederacy seceded from the Union and fought the Civil War to preserve slavery, how slaves helped the Union win the war, and why Union soldiers were willing to lay down their lives in battle to preserve the Union. We discovered a letter from a Union cavalry officer who described how horses suffered more than men from the constant campaigning, particularly when Grant's forces dogged the Confederates in the final year of the war, and how horses often died from exhaustion and starvation. And we compared that letter with several works from Xenophon on horses and ancient cavalry. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. Our primary source was this collection of Civil War letters written by ordinary soldiers, plus several letters from General Pickett, and also the post-battle correspondence between Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. After the war, Longstreet became a Republican, serving in the Federal Army to further Reconstruction. This angered many Confederates, many of whom blamed Longstreet for the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg. We reflected on an incident when General Longstreet led Federal troops to quell an insurrection by white supremacists on the outskirts of New Orleans in 1874, and to defend his military reputation, since many former Confederates wanted to blame him for the Gettysburg defeat for political reasons. James Longstreet published his memoirs in 1896, using the information he gathered for Lee's abortive memoir. His memoirs are not as memorable as Grant's memoirs, as he has few observations apart from a strict military history. Another major source we consulted was the Teaching Company lectures on the Civil War by Professor Gary Gallagher. This is both a history of the Civil War battles and an account of the social and political conditions, both North and South, during the war. The U.S. Army War College also has many interesting lectures on Civil War military strategies. This military professor notes that the Confederates had 7 cavalry brigades, and that Jeb Stuart was assigned only 3 of them. Why didn't Robert E. Lee send out other cavalry brigades to gather intelligence on the Union Army positions? The 2 cavalry brigades with him at Gettysburg were irregular forces recruited for the battle. Lee thought that they were undependable and poorly trained. Why were the 2 competent cavalry brigades guarding the supply lines in the rear in the Shenandoah Valley? Why weren't they with him in Gettysburg? And the reason is Jeb Stuart did not want these cavalry leaders to steal his glory. One was previously a competing suitor for the hand of his current wife, and he detested the leader of the other cavalry brigade. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.